Sagebrush Siding sat on a flat piece of Wyoming land where the wind never seemed to stop. The railroad track cut across the white plain like a dark line drawn with a ruler. On one side stood the depot, a water tank, and a small row of rough wooden buildings. On the other side stood the new schoolhouse, fresh boards still pale against the gray sky. It was not much of a town yet, but it was all the people had. Elmer Donnelly was the station agent, and on that late November afternoon he was trying to keep the depot stove hot and the telegraph line alive at the same time. He had just set a coal scuttle by the stove when the wire began to click. He straightened at once. The sound came sharp in the little room. It was the only steady thing in the storm. He read the message twice before he fully believed it. A freight car with winter supplies had been set out 2 miles south at Willow Cut. The train crew could not move it because the snow was already too deep on the line. The car held flour, lamp oil, and stove parts for Sagebrush Siding. If the drifts kept building, the track would be lost by morning. Elmer looked out the depot window. Snow was slanting across the tracks in hard, white lines. The west wind had already started to fill the ditch beside the rails. He could see the schoolhouse through the storm, a square, dark shape with one thin smoke trail rising from the roof. The smoke bent sideways and broke apart. He took the message to the schoolhouse himself. Ruth Bell, the teacher, had been trying to hold class since early morning. 4 children sat in their coats with their hands tucked under their arms. One little boy had red ears from the cold. Ruth stood by the stove, but the stove was little more than a box of iron with a cracked pipe and one loose elbow joint. It gave off more smoke than heat. Elmer held up the telegraph slip. Ruth read it and let out a slow breath. "That freight car has what we need," she said. "If we do not get that stovepipe and flour, I cannot keep these children here. The town store is almost bare, too." One of the children, a girl named Annie Webb, asked, "Will the storm take the train away?" "Maybe not the train," Elmer said, "but it may bury the track." He said it plain because there was no use lying. Sagebrush Siding had only been planted that fall. A few railroad men lived in the bunkhouse. 2 ranch families had built cabins near the creek. Ruth Bell had come west to teach the children before winter closed the roads. The people were trying to make a town where there had been only grass and sage. If the winter beat them now, some of them would pack up and go. Elmer went back to the depot and found Hank Mercer leaning against the baggage platform, warming his hands around a tin cup of coffee. Hank was an old rail hand with a thick back, a gray beard, and eyes that missed little. He had worked the line for years and had a way of looking at weather as if he knew its name. "We have a problem," Elmer said. "That snow in the west tells me that," Hank said. Elmer handed him the telegraph message. Hank read it, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat. 2 miles, he said. 2 miles, Elmer answered. "We can make it with the handcar if the drift does not choke the rail first." Elmer stared at him. The handcar was a rough little thing with a flat frame, 4 iron wheels, and a pump lever in the middle. It was made for track workers, not winter storms. "You think it will hold?" "It will hold enough if we keep pushing," Hank said. "But we go now." Elmer nodded. He had no better plan. He grabbed a lantern, a shovel, a pry bar, and a blanket to wrap around the lamp. Hank found a second shovel, a short crowbar, and a sack of coal. They rolled the handcar from the shed onto the track. The iron wheels made a dry clicking sound against the rail, then went still as the snow caught them. The 2 men climbed onto the platform and began to work the lever. At first the car moved with a quick little jerk, then picked up speed. The track ahead was white, but the steel tops of the rails still showed through. The handcar danced over the joints, and the wind hit their faces like cold fists. The first half-mile went by in a fight. The snow was not deep yet, but it was loose and sharp. It blew over their boots and up into their sleeves. Elmer pumped the lever until his shoulders burned. Hank kept his eyes on the rail and called out when the front wheel wandered close to the edge of the track. "Keep her straight," Hank said. "I am trying," Elmer said through clenched teeth. "Try harder," Hank said, and then he gave a short laugh that sounded more like a cough. The laugh helped. Elmer gripped the bar and pushed again. The handcar rolled past a wooden milepost, then past a low cut where the wind had already built a drift as high as Elmer's knee. Hank jumped off with the shovel and hacked a path through it, while Elmer held the car in place. The snow was light at the top, but hard underneath, packed by the wind. It came up in white chunks and slid off the rail in noisy sheets. When they started again, the sky had gone darker. The storm had its whole hand on the land now. The world was smaller than a few yards of rail and the circle of light from the lantern. Beyond that was nothing but moving white. By the time they reached the creek crossing, both men were wet to the bone. The bridge was narrow, and snow had drifted against its side. The handcar wheels squealed on the frozen rails. Elmer looked down through the moving slats and saw black water under the ice. The creek ran fast enough to keep one patch open, and the open water steamed in the cold. "Do not look down," Hank said. Elmer did not answer. He kept his eyes on the far bank and pumped harder. The handcar crossed with a low rattle and bumped onto solid ground again. Both men let out the breath they had been holding. A little later, Hank lifted his hand. "Stop." Elmer braked the car with his boot and looked ahead. At first, he saw only a long white hump on the track. Then the hump shifted, and he made out the end of a red boxcar half buried in a drift. The roof was bright with snow. The side door had frozen shut. One wheel on the south side was packed deep in ice. "There it is," Hank said. Elmer felt a hard rush of relief that almost made him dizzy. The car was still there. The supplies were still there. He climbed down and waded toward it, snow slipping into his boots at every step. The wind had packed drifts against the car so deep that he had to use both hands to push his way along the side. The door would not move at first. Hank came up behind him with the pry bar and set the end into the frozen seam. He leaned his weight on it, and Elmer pulled from the other side. The metal groaned. Ice broke loose with a sharp crack. The door slid open just enough to show the dark inside. A smell of flour, oil, and cold iron came out all at once. "There are our winter bones," Hank said. Inside, the car was stacked with what the town needed most. Flour sacks were piled 3 high near the door. 2 crates held lamp oil in metal cans. Near the back sat a wooden box of stove parts, wrapped in straw and old newspaper. Elmer pulled one of the stove elbows free and held it up to the lantern light. It was exactly the right size for the schoolhouse pipe. He did not waste time looking at the rest. The storm was getting worse, and the line behind them could disappear at any minute. They worked fast. Hank passed out the sacks of flour, one by one. Elmer carried the oil cans. He tucked the stove parts under his arm. The weight of the metal box pulled at his shoulders, but he would not set it down. When the handcar was loaded, it sagged low on its springs. The lever stood at a hard angle. Elmer looked at the pile and then at Hank. "We will never move this back," he said. "We will move it," Hank said. "We just will not do it fast." They tied the load down with rope from the freight car and a strip of canvas Hank had in his coat. Then they climbed onto the handcar and began the long push home. This time, the car moved slower. The extra weight made every joint feel rough, and every rail joint hit like a hammer. Elmer pumped while Hank guided the front. The lantern swung low between them, throwing gold light over the flour sacks and the frosted iron bars. Snow slapped the sides of the car. It piled on the front board and slid off in white sheets. Halfway back, Elmer's right hand began to numb. He switched hands and blew on his fingers, but the cold went right through the gloves. Hank must have seen him shake, because he took one side of the lever and said, "Let me do the work for a stretch." Elmer did not argue. He stepped back and held the lantern tight against his coat. Hank pumped with a steady rhythm, strong and even, like a man cutting wood. The car picked up a little speed. The rails shone ahead in the lantern light, then vanished again in white. At the creek crossing, the wind hit them so hard that the lantern nearly blew out. Elmer threw the blanket around it and huddled over the flame with both hands. For one long minute he could not see the rail in front of the wheels. Hank shouted for him to keep the light high, then low, then high again. The car rocked, but it stayed on the track. Then the storm opened for a breath. Through the blur, Elmer saw the lights of Sagebrush Siding ahead. Not many lights, only a few yellow squares in the dark, but they were enough. One was the depot lamp. One was the bunkhouse. One came from the schoolhouse window. The sight gave him new strength. He and Hank pushed with all they had. The handcar rattled past the depot, past the water tank, and along the short spur that curved beside the schoolhouse. By then the snow was so thick that Elmer could barely tell where the ground ended and the drift began. The schoolhouse door flew open before they reached it. Ruth Bell stood in the doorway with a shawl over her shoulders. Behind her were the children, 2 ranch women, and a pair of railroad men who had come to help when they heard the handcar coming. Their faces glowed in the lamplight. Ruth's eyes went at once to the flour sacks and the stove parts. "You got it," she said. "We got it," Elmer answered. The men and women rushed out into the storm. They lifted the sacks one by one and carried them inside. One of the railroad men, Joe Madsen, took the stove elbow from Elmer and said he knew how to fit it. Hank pointed to the broken pipe on the stove, and the 2 of them knelt down in the cold room to work. Elmer poured lamp oil into the glass lamps while Ruth sent the children to stack wood near the stove. The stove took time. The old pipe had to be cleaned. One bolt was stuck, and Joe had to heat it with a coal ember before it would turn. Elmer stood by the door and stamped the snow from his boots. He was too tired to sit, but he could not leave. He watched the men fit the last piece of pipe into place and twist it tight. At last, Hank held out a match. "You light it, Elmer," he said. Elmer struck the match on the stove box. The flame flared bright and small in his hand. He touched it to the kindling. The wood caught with a soft crack. Then the coal followed, first with a red glow, then with a deeper heat. The stove gave one long sigh, as if it had been waiting for this all day. At first, the warmth was only near the iron door. Then it spread across the room. The cold on Elmer's back began to fade. Ruth laughed once in a tired, surprised way and put both hands over her face for a moment. The children crowded closer to the stove but did not touch it. They watched the fire with wide eyes, as if they had never seen anything so fine. One of the little boys said, It feels like summer. Not summer, Hank said, grinning. Just less winter. Ruth opened the flour sack and set her hands on the white grain inside. We can bake tomorrow, she said. Real bread. You can, Elmer said. And you can keep school. She looked around the room at the children, the men with snow in their hair, the oil lamps now shining clean and steady, and the stove, giving off a full red heat. Then she nodded once. Yes, she said. We can. Outside, the wind kept tearing at the walls and piling snow against the windows. But inside the schoolhouse, the room grew warm enough that coats came off, hats were set on the bench, and red color came back to the children's cheeks. Ruth broke open a biscuit pan and mixed flour with water and salt. Someone found bacon in a crock. Joe Madsen cut the last of the stove rope and said the pipe would hold through March if the weather did not get meaner than it already was. Elmer finally sat down on the bench near the door. His arms ached, and his hands were raw from the cold. His clothes smelled of snow and coal smoke. Yet when he looked across the room, he did not see a bare schoolhouse anymore. He saw the first real heart of a town. The building was still small. The walls were still plain. The storm outside was still wild. But now there was heat in the stove, light in the lamps, and bread on the way. The people of Sagebrush Siding were no longer just waiting for winter to beat them. They were sitting together in the warm and making plans for morning. Later, long after the children had begun to nod off on their benches, Elmer stepped back out onto the porch. The blizzard had buried the handcar almost to the seats. The track vanished under drifts on both sides. Beyond the schoolhouse, the depot lamp shone weakly through the snow. Elmer pulled his coat tight and stood there for a moment. The night was hard and black, but the schoolhouse window behind him burned gold. He could hear voices inside and the soft crack of the stove. The town would still be there in the morning, he thought. That was enough for one night. Then he turned back to the light, lifted the heavy door against the wind, and went inside where the people of Sagebrush Siding were keeping warm together.